the real story. Because the verse that we're going to focus on and start with is one of the most misunderstood, misquoted verses in the Bible. And actually, it's not that the verse is misquoted, it's that it's accurately quoted from an inaccurate translation. And people, by and large, by now, people realize it's the wrong translation, but they keep quoting it that way because it makes a point that they like. The problem is, it's not the point Jesus was making. If Jesus would have wanted to say what people say he said, he would have said it. But he didn't. So we're going to look at it today and get the real story and then the rest of the story. And we're going to start off in Matthew. If you have your Bibles or tablets or phones, whatever it is nowadays, we're going to be in Matthew 16 and then later in Revelation 1. All the other verses are on the handout there, so you don't have to keep flipping back and forth. But that's where we will start, is Matthew 16. And we're going to focus on this idea today. It's there in bold. Knowing death is not the end gives an entirely different perspective on life. That's what we're going to talk about today on Easter, Resurrection Sunday, as we're reminded by this of what has been said a couple times, we should be reminded of every Sunday. Death is no longer the end. Jesus has shown us that. Well, what difference should it make? How should it impact us? That's what we're going to talk about. And as I said, we're going to start with Matthew 16. And just to give a little context for the verse we're going to focus on, we're going to read verses 15 through 19. And even then, some context. Jesus is with his disciples, his inner group of followers who have been with him for a while now. And he asks them, who do the people in general say that I am? He was definitely a well-known figure by this point. And he says, who do the people say? And so the disciples give some of the things they've heard. But then in verse 15, he says, but what about you, he asked, who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. Now, as he talks about this, let me just explain some of this as we go. Simon answers, you are the Messiah, and that was a special figure that the Jews had been waiting for hundreds of years. It's the same word as the word Christ, the Greek word, the Hebrew word, and it means anointed one, and they were waiting for this special person. Now, they didn't know initially that he would be the Son of God, and we don't know everything Peter understood at this point. You know, you and I, as we talk about the Trinity, we'll never fully understand, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, one God, three persons. But he definitely has insight into that. And Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. Now, not the Jonah of the big fish fame, but his dad was named Jonah. And so, Simon, son of Jonah. For he says, this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood. In other words, this wasn't just you sitting around saying, hey, I think you're the Son of God. But by my Father in heaven. In other words, you saw the miracles that testified to this. You saw the things that had happened, and that's how you've come to realize this. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Well, that seems pretty important, doesn't it? The keys to the kingdom of heaven. And we've all got keys, but those would be pretty special keys. What's he talking about there? Well, he's talking about the fact that soon after Jesus' resurrection on the day of Pentecost, the beginning of the church, God, through Peter, will tell people, here's how you get into the kingdom of heaven. And whatever Peter binds on earth, says this is what you have to do, be bound in heaven. Whatever he looses, you don't have to do, will be loosed in heaven. And again, it wasn't just Peter coming up with it. God spoke through him. But that's what he's talking about there. Now, the verse I want to focus on is verse 18. And I said, this is one of the most misunderstood verses in the Bible. And actually, it starts with a misunderstanding before we even get to the one we're going to focus on. Because it says there, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And the misunderstanding I'm going to talk about probably isn't the one you think. We realize that the Catholics misunderstand this in the sense they think Peter is the first pope. And so we have gone to the opposite extreme. And how many times have you heard someone say, well, there's two different words here. We know Peter means rock, but it means like a pebble. Whereas Jesus said, I'll build my church on the rock, the boulder, the cliff. That's not true. And if we weren't trying to protect ourselves from the Catholics and the popes, we'd know that wasn't true. Think about it. Jesus renamed Peter. His name was Cephas, and he named him Peter. Why would he name him Pebble? Would that be anything to be proud of? You used to be Cephas, and now you're Pebbles. Wow, thanks, Jesus. No, he called him the rock. It's the same word in Greek. It's just different. There's, in some languages, nouns have feminine and masculine and neuter forms. Well, rock is feminine, but to apply it to Peter, you couldn't say his name in feminine. You had to put it into masculine. It's the same word. Now, it doesn't mean Peter is going to be the first pope, but Jesus is making a play on words here. And he's saying, Peter, this confession and what you're going to do, the church will be built on that foundation. Now, at other times, he says that the foundation of the church is the apostles and the prophets, and he's the cornerstone. He uses different metaphors at different times. So that is what he said, what it sounds like there. But here's the thing we're going to focus on. He says, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. How many times have you heard someone refer to this verse and say the gates of hell will not overcome it or prevail against it? Has anyone heard that? Pretty often, huh? Matter of fact, look in your Bibles. Does your Bible have the gates of Hades or the gates of hell? One of my favorite translations is the English Standard Version. I had actually copied and pasted it from the site I always use, put it down here, and I'm reading along and like, really? They have hell. Now, the New Living Translation is a lot looser, and I'll say I wasn't surprised by that. But why is that there? Why is the difference? Now, sometimes, as we've been going through Colossians, remember, there's the word that has come up before in Colossians is teleon or teleos, and it can be translated as mature or perfect or complete. And different translations say, well, it shades a little this way or that. Is that the same thing that's happening here? Is there one word that you can either translate Hades or hell? No. There are two completely different Greek words. The Greek word for Hades is, you ready? Hades. They just transliterate it. The Greek word for hell is Gehenna, basically. So there are two different Greek words, but somehow translations will say we're going to put hell, even though it says, and no one argues, it says Hades. Well, why is that? The confusion started with the King James Version. Remember, it's sometimes called the Authorized Version because it was the first authorized English translation. It wasn't the first one, but the people who translated the Bible into English before that were burned at the stake because it wasn't authorized. Well, King James said, okay, go ahead, do an English translation. For some reason, when they got to this verse, even though the Greek word was clear, it's Hades, they put hell. I tried to find out. I don't know why they did it, but it doesn't matter. It's wrong. And even the New King James realizes that. If you have a New King James, it says Hades. Well, what's the point here? What's the meaning of each one? The word Gehenna was literally a trash dump around Jerusalem on the outside of the walls down in a valley, and they would burn their trash, and so it was constantly smoldering. And it is rightfully translated hell, this place of eternal separation from God. The word Hades, though, is different. The word Hades is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word Sheol, and it means the unseen world. And basically, it means death, the abode of the dead. In Psalm 18:5, it says, the cords of Sheol surrounded me, the snares of death confronted me. Now, that's an example of Hebrew poetry. And we don't recognize it because for us, great poetry is the end of every line or every other line rhymes, right? Jack and Jill went down the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. Now, I'm not saying that's great poetry, but that is English poetry. We like things to rhyme. Well, the Hebrews, they liked what it was called parallelism. They would say the same thing in two different ways, and it can be very helpful because it will tell you which words line up. Because you look there, the cords of Sheol surrounded me. The snares of death confronted me. You have cords and snares, surrounded and confronted, and then you have Sheol and death. Sheol was the place of death, the abode of the dead. It's basically death itself, where someone went when they died. Now, again, there is no question that the Greek word is Hades. But people and translations will still put hell. And they'll quote it that way. Even if they have a Bible that has Hades, they'll quote it as hell. Why is that? Well, the usual meaning is that Jesus says, I'm going to build my church. And the gates of hell will attack it, will try to overcome it, try to overpower it, but they will never succeed. Satan will never succeed in destroying the church. Have you heard that? It's a great thing. It's not at all what this verse says. And you look at it, and even if you don't know some of this, there should start to be one of those, I always talk about the wait a minute moments. When it talks about the gates of hell will not overpower the church, How many times do gates attack anything? Gates don't attack. And in the ancient world, when you had these cities with gates, if one city got ready to attack the other city, they didn't say, hey, grab the gates, let's go, and attack this city. Now, if you ask someone who quotes it as the gates of hell will not overcome the church, they'll say, well, the gates represent the power, the strength, the might of a city. And you'll see some translations that will say the powers of hell. Well, they're mistranslating two words then. It's clearly gates and clearly Hades, but some translations have the powers of hell. No. Now, the gates in ancient times did represent sort of maybe the seat of business or government. Things weren't as organized as they are today. Not that our government's necessarily organized, but it wasn't even what we have. And so city business would be conducted at the gates. You see this when it comes to Lot in Genesis. Remember when Lot and Abraham separated and Lot pitched his tents near Sodom, and the next you read about he's in Sodom, and then when the two angels come to destroy the city, he's at the gates. He had become involved in the business of the city. That's true, but it does not represent the military might of a city. The gates never represented the offensive might. Now, if you had big, strong gates, well, that was good defensively. Someone came to attack you and they can't get through your gates because they're big, they're strong, they're powerful. But that's not at all how people use this. It's not that hell is being attacked. Hell is attacking the church with its gates. No, that makes no sense at all. What is the purpose of gates? Let's just think about that as we read this verse. What's the purpose of gates? Well, it's twofold. First of all, you have gates because you want to allow access in or out. Otherwise, you just have a wall. There'd be no gate. Then people couldn't get in or out. But you also have gates because you want to restrict the access, or else you wouldn't have anything. There'd just be an opening. People would go freely in and out. Well, as you think about the gates of Hades, what is their purpose? Do the gates of Hades restrict people from, and remember, this is death. Do they restrict people from getting into death or out of death? It's not real hard to die, is it? You can pretty freely get into death. You can pretty freely die. Matter of fact, when I preached this sermon years ago in Phoenix, the county we're in is Maricopa County. So I did some research to find out what's the death rate in Maricopa County. So I thought I would update things as I moved here to Allen County, and I looked it up and find out what's the death rate in Allen County. Does anyone know offhand what the death rate is in Allen County? Yeah, it is pretty high. Anyone know that this is a trick question? You know what the death rate is in Allen County? Same as Maricopa County, same as every county and everywhere. It's 100%. Everyone who's born dies. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, that's the death rate. Everyone dies. Everyone can get into Hades. It's not picky. Sure, come right in. And it says there in Job, when a cloud vanishes, Job 89 or Psalm 89:48. Start with that one. It says, "What man can live and not see death? Can he deliver his soul from the power of Sheol?" Well, no. What man can live and not see death? No one. Everyone is going to die. So you can easily get into Hades, but you can't get out, can you? It says in Job 7, when a cloud vanishes, it is gone, so he who goes down to Sheol does not come up. People don't die and then say, okay, I was tired of that, I decided to come back. It just wasn't for me. I'm going to start living again. No, the gates of Hades let people in, but they don't let people out. Does that make sense? Yeah, that was known to them. Now, there have been some jailbreaks from Hades. There have been resurrections. People who died came back to life. We have 3 recorded resurrections in the Old Testament. Elijah the prophet resurrected one person. Elisha, his successor, resurrected one person while he was alive. And then the most interesting resurrection of all, between the Old or the New, there was a time when some people were burying a body, and they saw some marauders in the distance, and so they got scared and in a hurry, and they threw this body into Elisha's tomb. It touched his dead bones, and that body came back to life. Wow, that was pretty cool. But here's the thing. Those 3 people, they died again. They weren't still alive when Jesus got on the scene. And the people who came back to life in the New Testament, even the ones Jesus himself resurrected, they all died. Everyone dies, and some people might escape briefly, not many on a worldwide scale, but even they go back into Hades and they can't get out. Now, you have to realize then what the mindset was at this time. As Jesus is saying this, why would he say this? Well, Old Testament believers had a belief in the resurrection. It wasn't something that just started with Jesus and his resurrection. And we see this in John 11 when Lazarus dies. Remember, Jesus goes to the tomb, and this is on your handout as well. And there's Lazarus' sister Martha, and Jesus said to her, verse 23, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." So the Jews had a belief, okay, there is going to be a resurrection on the last day. But you know what? You can't really blame them if they had a little doubt, could you? Because their whole lives, their whole history, the whole history of history, people have died and not come back. And even the ones who came back for a little bit, it wasn't like, okay, I'm immune to it now. I got vaccinated. I can't die anymore. They died too. And so they had this belief, but it makes me think of the Father. You know, I believe, help my unbelief, because everywhere I look, it says the opposite. It says no one's coming back. Well, Jesus knew that was the mentality, and that's why he says this verse. He says, "I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it, will not prevail against it." In other words, as Christians, yes, the church of Christians, everyone who is a believer, you will die still. It's not over yet. But eventually, the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church. What were the gates meant to do? To keep people in. It says eventually, no, it will not prevail. You will get out of Hades. You will get out of death. See what Jesus is saying there? Jesus is saying that there is more to this than you see. I know you've seen this the whole time, but let me promise you. And why was that so important? Why was it important that he say that? Well, first of all, and I think we can understand it even from our perspective now, but there was a lot of uncertainty about Hades, about Sheol, about dying. You know, think about it. Ecclesiastes 9:10 says, "Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might, for there is no activity or planning or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol where you are going." Well, that doesn't sound like a very, exciting place, a very fun place, a place I really want to go, but at the same time I know I'm going there. And so there's this uncertainty, and I think even for us, there's a part of me that knows as a Christian, when I die, I'm going to heaven, and I'm fine with that until I think about me actually dying. And then there's that part that says, especially if it's not something sudden, if it's not, a car accident, which my daughter says I might be prone to. As a matter of fact, she says, if you ever die in a car accident and the police tell us it wasn't your fault, I'm going to tell them, re-examine the evidence. You've got to be wrong. She doesn't think a lot of my driving, but, at least that might be quick. I wouldn't have that time. But, there are times when I think about, laying in a bed maybe, and wow, there's some uncertainty there. There's some elements, some potential, I believe, help my unbelief. And so Jesus knew that. And plus, the other reason he said it goes back to everyone dies. And as Christians, there's even worse news. Being a Christian might shorten your lifespan. Jesus had told them that. You look at some verses I put down there. Matthew 10, Jesus had already told them, "Brother will deliver brother over to death, and father his child, and children will rise against their parents and have them put to death, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake." Come and be a Christian. They know that's what they're facing. Matthew 12, it says, "But the Pharisees went out and conspired against Jesus, how to destroy him. Jesus, aware of this, withdrew from there." Well, his closest disciples saw that and realized if they get him, they aren't going to be content with just him. They're going to want to get us too. Matthew 16, then Jesus told his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." Once again, I'm being told there's a strong chance my life is going to be shorter because I'm a Christian. And then the last verse, Revelation 12, gives us this big picture. It says, "Then the dragon became furious with the woman, Mary, and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus." It's talking about Christians there. Satan, the dragon, is going to be opposing us throughout all of history. And we see that, and we know it's true. And so you add that together, this uncertainty about death, about what it's going to be like, but the absolute certainty it's going to happen to me unless Jesus comes back, and because I'm a follower of Jesus, it might happen sooner than it would otherwise. And Jesus realizes, I need to give you something, to give you some assurance, to give you some hope, to give you some peace. And so he tells them this. And I think it weighs on us differently because we don't face maybe the threat of death that they did, but we still have things that this verse speaks to us as well, and it's important. And so Jesus says, Christians, you're still going to die. That's the bad, the good news or the bad news. Here's the bad news. You're still going to die, but you're not going to stay dead. And I know you've heard that, but let me promise you that. And then he does more than promise it. Jesus proves it. And that's what Easter Sunday is. It's Jesus showing, here's someone who dies, but look what's different. And here's where we get the rest of the story. This verse in Matthew, that when we understand the real story of that verse, look at the rest of the story in Revelation 1, 17 to 18. If you remember Revelation, it's this book where it's just that. It's a revelation. It's a vision from God to the Apostle John, one of those close inner followers that was there when Jesus made this promise of Matthew 16, 18. And he receives this vision, and there's Jesus there. And it says in verse 17, when I, John, saw him, Jesus, I fell at his feet as though dead. But he laid his right hand on me, saying, and just even that, realize people talk today, hey, I had this vision of Jesus. It was so cool. Every time you see a vision of Jesus or an angel, no one's saying, hey, this is so cool. They're all afraid they're going to die. That's one test. Was it a real vision of Jesus? Well, did you think you were going to die? That's at least one test. And so you see this here. I fell at my feet as though dead. But he laid his right hand on me, saying, fear not. I am the first and the last, the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades. So, in light of what we just saw, what's Jesus saying? He says, you know what? When I got out, it was more than just a jailbreak. I ain't never going back. I'm not dying again. And that's good for him, but then he says something that's important for us. He says, guess what I took when I left? I've got the keys of death and Hades. I've got the keys to the gates. And so when I'm ready, I'm going to come back and unlock the gates, and you'll be able to get out of death. That's what he's saying. He says, I'm going to make good on that promise I told you before, that the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church. You'll get in, and you won't be able to get out on your own, but when the time is right, I will get you out because I've got the keys now. That's what Jesus was saying then, and that's what he follows up in Revelation with. And that promise and Jesus' proof from his resurrection, and we talked about the nature and the definition of proof, and I realize we didn't see it, but there's more evidence for the resurrection than against it. That's not the focus of the sermon today, but just realize human history outside the Bible tells us there was a man named Jesus. He was crucified on a cross under the authority of Pilate, and there was this rumor going around that he had come back to life. So all of that is outside of the Bible. When you look at it then, all right, how do you explain? History tells us he died and he was buried, and then you have what happened to the body. There is no credible alternative to the resurrection. There's no alternative that has as much evidence as the resurrection does. So it doesn't prove it in one sense, but it makes more sense to believe in it than not. So Jesus promised it. His resurrection then gives that element of proof that I'm not just saying it's going to happen, I've shown it's going to happen, and it gives us hope. It gives us confidence. There's a movie called Big Fish. It's a weird movie. It was directed by Tim Burton, and if you know his movies, they're weird movies. But there's one real interesting element. It shows the main character all throughout his life, from a young boy to an old man. And when he's a young boy, he gets this vision of how he's going to die. And he has reason to believe it, and it turns out it's true. Well, think about it. If you knew how you were going to die, and in the vision what age you were going to be when you died, you could do anything else, and you knew you wouldn't die. And so he does that. He does all kinds of daring, reckless things. He's in the war, and all these paratroopers, I'll go back again on the mission because I know I can't die. I saw how I'm going to die. I saw when I'm going to die. Wouldn't that be amazing? Well, we don't have the exact same thing, But because of what Jesus did, we have something similar. I can focus on living for God because I know what happens after I die. I know death's not going to keep me in. I know Jesus has the keys, and when the time is right, He's letting me out. So I can focus on living for Him. I don't have to worry about that. And so that it impacts us in three ways. First of all, it gives us hope in the face of persecution. 2 Timothy 3:12 says, "Indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ will be persecuted." Now, I don't know about you, but up until, definitely when I was young, which is further back now than it used to be, but, high school or such, I thought the persecution of Christians was over. I thought, well, that's a Roman thing, the lions, the Colosseum. But now you have groups like Voice of the Martyrs, and now you have Facebook and media. But even before that, you had the groups like Voice of the Martyrs and things like that. And you realize there is persecution still going on, or at least you should. In fact, I saw an article just this morning. It said that since 2005, over 1 million people have been killed for being Christians. Around 90,000 a year. That's over 1,700 people a week are killed because they're Christians. You think this verse means something to them? To know? And have seen the proof from Jesus? This life isn't all there is. I can face this persecution. And you know what? Again, we aren't under the threat of death, but we do face things. Just general things, let alone we face suffering as a result of our faith. Satan is opposing us. He's working against us. And if this life was all there is, wow, that'd be hard to take. But think about it this way. Imagine that you wake up on New Year's Day, and I don't know when you wake up. I don't stay up to see the ball drop anymore, so I wake up about the same time as usual. But whenever you wake up on January 1st, the first hour is really bad. Now, not the worst bad. It's not like someone who's close to you dies or this whole illustration breaks down. The rest of the year wouldn't matter. But it's just not good. It's bad. It's a rough hour. But then the rest of that day and the rest of the 364 days of that year are fantastic. They're wonderful. They're amazing. Would you look back on that year and say, oh, it was a rotten year. That first hour was so rough. Or you say, what a great year. Boy, I'd take that one again. Well, that's us as believers. We live a relatively short time here, and boy, there are some times when it's tough. There's some things that people in general just face. There's some things that I face specifically because I'm a Christian and Satan is opposing me. There's times I don't know which is which. It's tough. Well, Jesus is saying you can have a different perspective because this life, you're just passing through here. As Peter says, you're an alien in this land. Your home is somewhere else, and it's going to be better and longer. Focus there. It gives us hope in the face of persecution. It also gives us priority in the midst of distractions. Matthew 6:19 through 21. Jesus said, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." It's so easy to get caught up on things, and not the first one's more about the negative things. This is more about the good things, the positive things, the things that, boy, I'd really like to have that. I really like to spend my time doing that. And not all this is bad. Don't understand me, because we just saw last week in Colossians, asceticism, this extreme self-denial, that's absolutely wrong. It says in the Bible, God has given us all things for our enjoyment. We just shouldn't try to enjoy all things. Find the ones that really fit you, that really restore you, and keep it in this perspective that says, you know what, that same thing. I'm here on this earth for a relatively short time. I'm going to be in heaven forever, and even my time on earth should be impacted by my relationship with God. I have a different perspective now. I'm living now for eternity. It's not just, hey, do whatever you want now and you've got the rest of it. No, I'm living now for eternity, and so that should impact me. I shouldn't focus an amount of time and effort and everything else on the things of this world when I realize there's an eternal perspective here. There's a supernatural reality here. I have a chance to have a relationship with God here and now. Not just, okay, you're forgiven and eventually things will start. No, the moment I come out of those waters of baptism, God, I want I want to get to know you. I want to live with you as much as I can. And God says, yeah, that's my plan. And so this should give us a different perspective. This world is not all there is. And then lastly, it should give us urgency in light of eternity. And by this, I'm talking about witnessing. We need to realize that what Jesus says is true for everyone. Everyone's going to be let out of Hades. But I need to tell people what needs to happen to prepare them for that moment. And sometimes we get so caught up in this, I'm just not good at talking. We need to make it far more natural that I just spend time with the people I'm around. And I bring it up like I would anything else. You hear about a good restaurant. What do? You tell people. You're excited about your ball team. You tell people. You work it in. Monday, when you go back to work or you're around your friends or neighbors or whatever, hey, what'd you do this weekend? And they talk about, hey, we got together at church a little early. We had a meal. We don't always do that. Don't lead into a sermon from that. Just let it be out there. And as you face things in life, this happened. And that's really tough. It is. But I read this verse in the Bible that really helped me. Or we had this sermon. Or I had a... Just bring it up natural. And then let God work. And work from there. Go from there. But have an urgency about it. Because one last thing here, this promise of Jesus is also a warning. Because everyone is going to be let out of the gates of Hades. The last passage that I want us to look at is Revelation 20, verses 11 to 15. So it's coming to an end. Jesus has told John about things that are going to happen here on earth, and now here's how things are going to end. He says, "Then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. From his presence earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books according to what they had done." And then, as often happens in writing like this, it goes back a little bit and gives you sort of what's the prequel, in a sense. Verse 13, "And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead." Hades is always pictured as a grave, so it includes the sea. Don't want anybody to feel left out. You died at sea, you're going to get to come out too. And so he says that they gave up to death, and that's where all the dead came from there. And they were judged, each one of them, according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. That's hell. There will be no more death. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. Now, what's that talking about here? It's just what Jesus said. This is when he's going to use those keys. He's going to let everyone out of death, and we're all going to stand before God, and he's going to read from the books, plural. And the books record everything we've ever done. Yeah, everything. Fortunately, they've done similar things, so it won't be like, hey, I'm the only one. But what's going to happen here, and what this is, we see it in Colossians. Every once in a while as we're going through there, you remember how Paul, he'll just remind you people, like, I'm talking so much about you going to heaven, and that's where I want your focus to be, but just a quick reminder, it's not because you were so good, it's because God is so gracious, because you really weren't so good. Well, that's what this is. It's like the last reminder. God is going to, these books are going to record what everyone has ever done. It's all going to be put out there, and every person will realize, based on what I have done, I don't deserve to even be in the line of sight of God. I deserve to be eternally separated from him, and that's true. But then he's going to read from the book of life, and everyone who has accepted Jesus as their Savior, everyone in the Old Testament who was saved based on faith, those people have had their penalty paid. And so those people will spend eternity with God in heaven. That's the difference between the books and the book. Salvation is by grace. This is just God's last reminder that salvation is by grace. As I read off this list, there's none of you that can raise your hand and say, hey, I deserve to get in. But anyone whose name is not written there will not be spending eternity with God. And that's not God sending people to hell. It's God saying, you chose not to have a relationship with me here on earth. I'm just extending that. I'm not forcing you to have one with me for eternity. Well, what do I need to do now? I always like to end things with how do I take this and make it practical? How do I walk out of here not just knowing some cool new facts, but really different? Well, first of all, if you're a non-believer, what do you need to do? Eat, drink, and be merry. Really, it makes sense. If you don't believe there's anything after this life, you'd be really foolish not to live for this life as much as possible. Doesn't that make sense? If you don't believe it, live for here and now. Now, I say that, you know what makes even less sense? Is if you do believe in a life after this life and you aren't living for that life. There's a lot of Christians. Here's the thing. Christianity cannot be true and unimportant. It may not be true. Now, I hope you realize I believe it is true. I believe there's more evidence for it than against it. But it may not be true. But it cannot be true. You cannot sit here and say, I believe it's true. Oh yeah, where are we going for lunch? I believe there's a God. I believe that my sin separated me from God. I believe that He sent His Son to die for me. I believe that because I've received that grace, I'm spending eternity with heaven. Oh, yeah. That makes no sense at all. If I'm a believer, I need to live in light of what we've seen, that there is an eternity. And it doesn't just impact my eternity, it impacts my now. And you know what makes the least sense of all? Is if you're one of those people who don't believe, and either you don't really have a good reason, or you just, I haven't decided. I'm not sure if there's a God, not sure if the Bible's true. No, this is important. You know what? I'm not sure if I like bananas. And if I ever try one, I'm almost certain it will validate the fact that I am pretty sure I don't like bananas. I've never tried one. You know what? If I get to heaven and find out bananas were good, it's not the end of the world. But if I stand before God and find out there is a God and I never really checked into it, that one's more important, isn't it? It makes absolutely no sense to not believe or not be sure and not find out. And I tell you what, you got a better chance now than you usually have to research it and find out. There's a movie out called The Case for Christ. And it's not often you can research this while you're sitting down eating popcorn, but you can right now. And if you aren't familiar with that movie and the book that led to it, it's about a reporter who was an atheist and very comfortable in his atheism, but his wife began getting messed up in this whole Christian stuff. And like, well, I'm going to just prove it's wrong. And he was a reporter. He knew how to investigate. And so he investigated the evidence for Jesus in the Bible. And you know what he found out? There's more evidence for it than there is against it. And he became a Christian himself. And so if you aren't sure, go see the movie. It's in theaters right now. Because it makes the least amount of sense to say, either I don't believe, I really haven't checked, or I just don't know. We're talking about eternity. Everyone is going to be let out of Hades. And they're going to stand before God. And as we close today, as we sing our hymn of invitation, I like to call it again a hymn of decision, because every one of us here is now faced with some decision or the other. Again, it might be this biggest decision of, well, I accept Christ as my Savior. It might be the decision, well, I've accepted Him as that, but I'm really not living a life consistent with that. I believe there's a God, believe He died for sins, and yeah. And so somewhere on that scale, you need to make a decision. And if you feel like you need to come forward to make that decision, to talk with me or someone else, go ahead and do that now. But whatever it is, don't leave here the same.